Everyone to the DataWorks Salon on budgeting for data management, and we will get started in formally started in a moment as people start settling in. But in the meantime, I have something to show to you that one of the things we're doing is we'd love to have these sessions be very interactive, and so we're going to be posting a poll question, and I'm going to share the slides here, and you'll get the link in the chat. But again, today's session is around budgeting for data management, and we know this is an important topic for people that people are thinking about for their own work and in line with funder policies, and that we'd love to hear your thoughts on an initial poll question we have that's on a platform called Slido. If none of you have heard about this, it gives the ability to both answer and ask questions. We'll be using it later for the Q&A, where you'll be able to put in questions of your own and upvote others' questions. But in the meantime, we're starting up that we're going to have a link in the chat shortly that goes to this particular poll that's asking questions about your feelings of preparedness. So as we're settling in, take a moment to answer that poll. It'll be open for a while, but we'll do that as we're waiting for other people to come on, and we'll start shortly in a moment. So I'm going to get started. So for those of you who are just joining, so welcome to the DataWorks December Salon on budgeting for data management. I'm the program director for DataWorks at FASEB, and on behalf of our team, which includes my colleague Emily and FASEB Science Policy Fellow Grace, who you'll be hearing from later, we're really excited to host this webinar on this really important topic, and to have it be not just actually a webinar, but really a salon and a conversation space for us to be able to talk to each other and for you to interact with other researchers who are working on this important topic. And as I said in the last slide, there's a link in the chat to a system we're using called Slido for a couple of things in the session. One, there's a question up there right now about your feelings of preparedness on the topic. And then later on, we'll be using that for our question and answer system. And if you haven't used it before, it's one of those systems where you can not only put in a question, but vote for or sort of add a second vote to other people's questions. So we'll use that to manage the Q&A. And we really have a great panel here. We know there's a lot of people sign up for this webinar because data management is important, and also having the appropriate resources to manage your data is equally important as well. So just some background. So again, we are the DataWorks team that works at FASEB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. And if you're not quite familiar with us as an organization, we're a federation of a bunch of scholarly societies, 28 specifically in the field of biology and biomedicine. And the mission of our organization in general is to advance health through research and education in this field, and to collaborate and bring our societies and members together. And in that theme of collaboration, we're looking at our role and the role of other scholarly societies in helping to bring communities together and to advance a culture of data sharing and reuse. And that's where the program DataWorks is positioned and where it was launched. And it's a partnership among the scholarly societies, but also with organizations like the ones that are on this panel, and thinking about bringing the community together in the biological and biomedical sciences to think about data sharing and reuse as more than just policy compliance, but really helping you all to think about how to manage your work in an easier way for you all. And in the case of this theme, to be able to have the resources you need to do this work. So this is a space for us to talk together about this topic and to learn from experts like our presenters today. And very briefly, DataWorks has 4 components. One is the Salon series. Then we also have the prize, which helps to highlight and incentivize researchers who are doing work in data sharing and reuse, so you can really learn from each other around what practices are effective. Coming soon, we're launching a community fellows program, and then launching next month is actually a pilot of the help desk for DataWorks that's going to be focusing on additional resources for research data management, sharing, and reuse in the biological and biomedical sciences. I'm really keen to, we're launching as a pilot because we're really keen to get your feedback on how we can serve the community and what we can do in our help desk that may be different from what you get in other resources. So that's a general picture of DataWorks. And now we're going to be transitioning to the particular topic that we have around budgeting and data management. And among the different topics, this is the one that we are looking at for this particular session to help make sure that you have the resources that you need. So as I mentioned, we're using Slido for this initial question, as well as the Q&A session later. If you have any questions about how that works, let us know and we'll help you with that because it's another experiment. So now I'm going to be handing it over to our moderator for today. We're really excited to have a group of guests and panelists and scientists to help us talk about this issue. So Dr. Russell Poldrack will be moderating our session, and he's the Albert Ray Lang Professor in the Department of Psychology and the Director of the Stanford Center for Open and Reproducible Science, which is key to this work. And he's also, we're very lucky that he's a member of the advisory committee for DataWorks. So his research focuses on neuroimaging to understand brain systems underlying decision-making and executive function. His lab is also engaged in the development of neuroinformatics tools to help improve the reproducibility and transparency of neuroscience, including initiatives like OpenNeuro.org and Neurovault.org, which are data sharing projects, as well as the Cognitive Atlas ontology. Ontology rather than anthology. So really welcome Russ to moderate our panel, and he'll present our other presenters.
All right, thanks very much for the invitation. Happy to be here. So, so thanks to all of you for joining the Salon on budgeting for data management. The issue of data management has long been important to many of us, but has come into everyone's spotlight with the advent of the new NIH data management and sharing policy that will be coming into effect early in 2023. And one of the really important aspects of the new policy is the explicit support for budgeting of costs related to data management and sharing, which is going to be the topic of today's session. And I'd really like to thank FASEB for their leadership around data sharing reuse through the DataWorks initiative, and to welcome today's speakers. So our first speaker today is Julie Goodman. Julie is the Countway Research Data Services Librarian, and part of the Harvard Library Research Data Services team. She works with students and faculty researchers in the sciences and partners with them to plan for the management of their data through the life cycle of their research projects. She also consults on research data management issues and assists researchers with citing and publishing their data. So Julie, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ, and thank you so much to the DataWorks team for inviting me to speak today. I hope my slides look good. Yeah, I have a couple of slides here, a little bit about the new NIH policy that Russ alluded to, and then some areas that can help indicate costs for data management and sharing. So the new policy does start January 25th, and it will require the submission of a 2-page data management and sharing plan about how data will be managed and shared throughout the entirety of a project. Investigators may request funds towards data management and sharing in the budget and the budget justification sections of their applications. And overall, researchers will have to comply with the approved plan and communicate any changes throughout. So the NIH recognizes that making data accessible and reusable for others may incur costs. So for that reason, investigators may request funds towards data management and sharing. The NIH has supplemental information on the allowable costs, which I'll break down here. So costs allowed in budget requests include things like curating data and developing supporting documentation, de-identifying data, local data management considerations, and preserving and sharing data through repositories. These are all considered your direct costs since they are directly benefiting the grant-supported project or activity. It's also important to mention that all allowable costs must be incurred during the performance period. So costs that cannot be considered part of data management and data sharing include infrastructure costs, typically included in indirect costs, and costs associated with the routine conduct of research. So infrastructure costs include facilities and administrative costs, or F&A, like operation and maintenance costs and administrative expenses. So routine conduct of research does include, costs associated with collecting or gaining access to research data. And overall, the organization is responsible for the management and accounting of costs consistently. So I just want to mention, here at Harvard, our various offices of research administration or sponsored programs are really taking point on the budgeting communication. However, there are indicators when writing your data management and sharing plan that can help pull out those related activities to DMS. So here are those kind of 6 elements NIH is looking for in the data management and sharing plan, and kind of mapping them to potential costs. It's very hard to understand where costs are involved, and I know John is going to walk through a case study next, but I did pull out 4 activities to demonstrate how costs vary in both dollar amount and then time effort as well. So these are examples from a guide published by OpenAir. There seem to be a lot more European resources when it comes to RDM budgeting. So it's also hard to transfer EU costs to US. But this guide is really great because there are so many factors that go into what costs to actually include. So it's a good guide to get familiar with all those activities. So this first example here pulls out just the time needed to actually write a data management and sharing plan. So this could range from a few hours to weeks, depending on the complexity of your project and how much you prepare ahead of time. The second example is for if you are acquiring data from an external source, is there a cost associated with getting that data? So while I don't think per the policy that costs to acquire existing data sets are allowed to be included in that DMS line item, this is just a good example of something that is really important to think about when you're planning your data needs. So consider any additional infrastructure to use and maintain that data. For example, to keep it secure, computing resources for analysis, those could go under your DMS costs. Third, considering the costs around data documentation and ensuring you have ample metadata. This example pulls out, the time to collect metadata alongside an experiment. This may seem daunting, but just think about, doing it as you work with the data instead of having to go back and fill in or remember certain information at the time of data deposit. Also, the amount you are willing and able to budget for dedicated help is important. Will you budget for more postdoc time to do these activities, or will you hire a dedicated staff person who has the expertise and the skills you are looking for? And then finally here, when it comes to data sharing, thinking about strategies for making data available in data repositories. So some repositories have costs associated with them, either for data deposit, data curation, or maintenance fees. So for example, Dryad does have an initial cost because they include some curation services, whereas Zenodo is a free to deposit because they don't have those services. I wanted to highlight Harvard DataWorks, which Harvard Library actively supports. We have data curation services available for a fee to help researchers and institutions offset some of those labor and administrative activities associated with creating and maintaining dataverse collections. We're also available to partner with research teams to support custom curation needs for larger or more complex data sets. So we have the service chart, which can assist you in breaking out the elements and dedicating funds for your data management and sharing budget. So the final 2 slides are kind of some questions that you should be asking yourself when creating a budget. We also highly suggest, this part of the budget does not get lost when you're doing the other budgeting areas. It should all be done together. And then I have listed some additional resources that we can share with the community. And yeah, I just want to thank you for your attention. Thank you to the team, Kaylin Boyd and Katie Micah, and then to Melissa Kaur from our Office of Research Administration, who has been a key partner in crime when talking about the policy to our faculty. So I look forward to John's case study and the following discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Julie. Just a reminder to everybody to please put any questions you have into the Q&A, and also if you see questions there that you're interested in, go ahead and upvote them so that we'll be able to get to the most popular ones during the Q&A. So our second speaker today is Jonathan Peters, who is Assistant Director of Data Management and Curation Services at Virginia Tech. In his position, Jonathan provides research data management planning, training, and curation support to researchers across Virginia Tech. He holds a PhD in meteorology from Penn State and researched aerosol cloud radiation interactions in shallow cloud systems. He's also a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Science, where he investigated data management policies and needs within the physical sciences. All right, so go ahead, Jonathan.
All right, very good. First, can you all hear me? First thing is to confirm we can be heard, and then I will share my slides. All right, hopefully I can be heard. I'll move ahead. All right, well, thanks so much, Russell, and thanks, Julie, for already covering a lot of stuff I might cover. And I'll just reiterate and add a little bit more detail or less detail, as the case may be. So talking about budgeting for data management and sharing, Julie has already provided a great start and talked about NIH's requirements and discussion about what allowable costs and non-allowable costs are. And so that's great. So what I was asked to do was add maybe a little bit of specific examples of how this has been done in the past. And a fun thing with this I want to note when I talk about it is, I'll start, is not often is this budgeted for. This is kind of a new thing to budget for. So the case I'm going to show is actually for a very large project where they worry more about these kind of things. So, but we'll talk more generalities, of course. Now, one thing I wanted to note at the beginning here was I've been working with on a NSF-funded project to look at costs within for data management, public access to data, to research data, called the Realities of Academic Data Sharing Initiative. And to give one of the outputs we have from our initiative is a more granular view on actions that researchers could take towards making their data publicly accessible, towards sharing data. So here's an example of just one of the 5 sections, one of the 5 tables of actions that we have that are associated. And this may be useful for you to use as a reference for things that may be considered, other data management actions you may be taking towards your research. So some of these things Julie actually already talked about directly, but some of them are a little different. Making decisions about what data to share or host. That takes time and energy to figure out, well, should I share this or should I not share this? Should I share a subsection of it? Preparing data for sharing, Julie talked about that, de-identification. Submitting data into a data sharing platform, time required to do so, not just the fees required. Creating good documentation, selecting or applying licenses to the data, talking about how the data should be reused. Migrating data file formats to be more open and accessible. So I'm not going to belabor the whole tables, but we'll make this available on. I'll add a link at the very end here. A link to a more granular set of actions that you can consider towards data management, towards budgeting for data sharing. So keep that in mind, and I'll add that at the end. Okay, so to the case study. So an example of case study. So I did do last year, as I helped a group who was doing a proposal to NASA for a very large engineering project for actually a satellite mission. And they had questions about data sharing that they're interested in addressing. So one thing they wanted to do was publicly share 3 terabytes of data for 10 years after the project is over in our data repository. So I run an institutional data repository here at Virginia Tech, and as Julie just said, this our institutional data repository run through the libraries. That's indirect costs, so that's not a budgetable cost. but our services are not typically set up to provide access to such a large amount of data. So we worked with this researcher to do some estimates on how much it would cost to store, to share and preserve 3 terabytes of data, maintaining its file integrity for 10 years. And we just used, to do this, we went ahead and looked on Amazon's simple storage service, S3 storage service, for 3 copies of the data. 3 copies is a good number to maintain preservation of the data, maybe have an opportunity to provide for file integrity. And we just priced it out. How much does it cost to maintain 3 terabytes of data for 10 years? At this time, it's around, it's around $8,000 for this amount of data. I expect a lot of you doing research are not going to be generating 3 terabytes of data and trying to share all of it, especially maybe just sharing a small subset. So don't get all worried about $8,000. But this is how you can price these kind of things out. Is try and figure out how much it would be. And noting that if somebody was trying to give me 3 megabytes of data to share within our repository, well, that's just covered by the library's indirect cost. It wouldn't be a direct cost of the researcher for us to provide. So certainly looking for services that you can take advantage of without having to budget for them is always a good idea. Now, it's not just depositing and sharing the data, it's also, and Julie talked about this as well, the curation support, the effort and time required, and potentially tools to make the data fair, to make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And in this case, we agreed we would budget for time and effort from the library. So if somebody like myself, some amount of their time on to provide advice and guidance to how to make the data reusable and of high quality when it was being shared, not just sharing 3 terabytes of a data dump, but making data that's of quality to share. And so my advice and guidance, or somebody similar to me at a point in time, far in the future, right? This is not next year, but also funding for a graduate assistant, and having the graduate assistant have a main part of their work to be involved in the data management, data visualization, data quality for this mission, for the satellite project that they were going to put in. So setting aside money for both data storage, data preservation, and data sharing, and also time and effort. And that's a really, I think, important part. Now, these things are hard to estimate. How much does it cost to do these things? Julie just went through some estimations about, ideas of how long it takes to document data and how long it takes to put it in appropriate formats for sharing. What I would tell you generally right now is the start. This is just a starting view as I was thinking about trying to provide help and advice here. At least at this point, I would thinking about also the categories that Julie shared and the ones we have in our RADS initiative, putting into the budgets a small amount of time dedicated for your research group, your graduate students, a lab manager, for preparing data for deposit and for sharing. And whether that's a small amount of time, maybe it's a week in a year of work, but putting it in the budget. NIH is saying we have to do this new thing, making sure that it's something that's a budgeted thing for these things. Making a quality data set and providing access to it is not something that just happens. These things take time and effort. So we definitely want to put in some budget towards it. And then as Julie had already also mentioned, towards data deposit fees. If you're using a repository that does cost to deposit and share the data through, whether it's Dryad or another repository, making sure that that's budgeted for as well. There may be services you can take advantage in different places. A lot of research libraries do have a repository. They provide access, provide services through for data deposit, but not all. And there are also other general repositories, but gotta find the one that's right for you and your community. But budget for them. And NIH needs to understand that there's money involved in doing this work, right? That's as far as I wanted to say. I'm happy to have any questions, and we'll leave it there. And I'll put the link in the chat right now that I was just talking about. I'll stop sharing.
All right, thanks very much. So we have a good bit of time for questions now. And just a reminder, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A section on Slido. So let's start with some of the questions that have been upvoted on Slido so far. The first one is, if data must be made available for several years after funding ends, how does one go about budgeting for future expenses after the end of the funding period? Julie, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, so actually, I don't know if I can answer that because a lot of the times you can't pay in advance for services that you have not received. So I'm looking at John and looking at the case study he just showed, and how did you actually pay for sharing that data for 10 years in the project that you just mentioned. You have to find a repository that you are able to pay in advance, right?
Yeah, well, so two things. One, this was a proposal, right? It was not yet funded. So that's one thing. So we're not executing this currently, but we may in the future. These things never go away. The other thing is in this case, because it is funds being transferred from one university department to another, we have an opportunity to do some fun budgeting transfer things within our university that might allow for this kind of thing. This generally is a big challenge, because you have to be in a position to be able to fund things ahead of time. As Julie just said, that's a real challenge, but we can do things within our institution that certainly cannot do outside of our institution. But this is a I should note that maybe Julie's heard the same thing. There have been a lot of questions about budgeting from the NIH, and a lot of times they're like, we're going to figure that out soon. But I've said that multiple times. So
Right. Yeah,
this is a very good question.
Definitely a challenging question. I'm assuming that over the next year or two, there's going to be a lot more discussion and clarification from NIH about all these questions as the rubber really starts hitting the road, and grants start getting reviewed that have these plans, and the institutes and centers that have to actually start making these kind of decisions. So my guess is we're a year away or so from like having more solid answers. Not that we can ever expect crystal clear answers from NIH, but it'll get better, I think.
So I am noting here, actually, Chedna Chines is suggesting that it was in their organization already said, as long as it's invoiced ahead of a time, it'll be accepted. So it's good to hear.
Yeah. All right. So another question, what should be done to ensure interoperability, particularly around machine readable data now and into the future? This affects what should be requested in the budget. Do you want to start with that, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. I can give some suggestions to that. Interoperability is a fun thing to define. It's a challenging one to define. I generally start with, and I think a good place to start is thinking about putting things in open and easily understood formats. So that's a good place to start. So thinking about, and I think I had it as one of the actions that you could consider when I shared my slides, but converting the data that you're providing access to into open and easily understood formats. So this is not always an easy thing to do. But if you have data that came out of a computational model that is used by 12 people in the world, which is really important for the work that's being done, right? That's the only way we can do the work. Finding ways to convert that data in that format into something like a tabular separated value or CSV format, or some other more open, less proprietary, less esoteric format is something that will make that data much more useful in the future to a much wider audience. So that increases its value. And this does take time and effort to do. But hopefully, if it's a good application, hopefully there's just a simple export or conversion thing you can do. But it could also take scripting, programming work.
Yep.
But that would be where I'd start in considering how to improve interoperability.
Yeah, I think certainly, getting away from proprietary formats, given that proprietary software goes away sometimes, is really important. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. If the data is on a university server, is that considered infrastructure? If the data is stored in the cloud, can those long-term storage costs be charged? Julie, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, so usually if you're using your university infrastructure to store data, that just comes into your regular operational costs. So you are generally not paying for that storage up to certain amounts. It's when you do need to get that extra maybe cloud storage to make data available. So I think that could be included in your budget line. So it really depends on your kind of data needs and what is available, at your institution. What are kind of the storage costs and limits that your university IT or research computing group has. Make sure you talk to them about within your plan, what types of data you're generating, the amounts, that will really dictate how much storage you can use locally. And then if you do need to use, external cloud storage, those are additional costs that you would need to think about.
Right. And then I guess the next question on Slido is also relevant. It sort of extends that out to compute as well. And my understanding is that, compute would not count as infrastructure, right?
Yeah, because I think that's, doing your data analysis, that's your routine conduct of working, you doing your work and doing your investigation. So yeah, no, I don't think so. But if you are maybe working with some core facilities and getting some additional support from maybe core facilities and using their services to transform data or use specialized equipment, that might be. I don't know. I think there needs to be a lot of conversations, with you, your program officer, and also the Office of Sponsored Programs on kind of where things can be allocated within your budget.
Great. Thank you. So a question that has popped to the top here. Some repositories are free and some require costs. How does NIH determine the appropriate cost for a data repository? Jonathan, do you have thoughts on that one?
I have thoughts. I do have thoughts. I think what if you look at the guidance that NIH provides regarding selecting data repositories, they have a supplement on this, and this is on the sharing.nih.gov website. So I'm going to try and recite it from memory kind of things, but they do expect or want you to share your data in places that are appropriate for the research community that the data originates from, and that it's going to be useful for the research community you're working in. So that is a aspiration they'd like you to meet. Therefore, if that repository costs money, their data deposit fees for that repository, then that is a reasonable cost, a reasonable appropriate cost. And if the best repository for your data, and that's a very general term, I know, but the best repository for your data is one that costs money, then that's going to be a reasonable cost. They kind of give a sorts of a hierarchy decision tree for how to make those choices about what repository to pick. But if it's the appropriate one for your community, that is a fine cost. In the end, these choices are all going to be discussion decisions associated with your study section, with your program officer.
Yeah, Julie, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there, and I'm seeing some of my kind of NIH gray colleagues on the call here, and that's for the NIH generalist repository ecosystem, and that's bringing together 7 of these generalist repositories, and I think maybe that's a question these platforms could also think of, where those platforms are trying to think about standardized metadata to facilitate interoperability, and we're doing training and outreach. Maybe we can think about, costs for data repositories, because there are some, like I said, Dryad that has costs because they offer data curation services, whereas Zenodo is free. So maybe that could be something that our generalist repositories could take on and look at what kind of are the standards in the field there.
Thanks. I want to jump out of the Q&A list for a second and kind of follow up on that. So how does each of you think about the choice between kind of generalist versus specialist repositories when you're looking for where to share your data? Do you want to start, Julie? Yeah,
sure. I mean, so our kind of guidance has been, and I think this goes along with what the NIH is thinking, that investigators should look for a domain or disciplinary repository first. Is there a data type specific repository for the type of data? So the one we go to a lot is, are you working with gene sequencing? Put it in geo. Then you may have other materials, other supplementary files that you need to deposit as well. So those could go in something like a generalist repository like DataWorks. So you may be using these multiple, combination of repositories. And then also you need to think about, does your institute designate a place? So, we keep coming back to the NDA over and over, which I know a lot of people, have headaches about, but it is one of those. The NIMH says, thou must deposit your data in our data archive, and that's where you have to put the data from your studies. So we can grumble about, how great that platform is, but some of our institutes and centers will be designating specific places. So that's where you need to go first. And then you can look for these kind of supplemental places as well.
Thanks. Jonathan, did you have thoughts?
I mean, one thing it reminded me when you were talking, Julie, was that NIH has also in the discussions they have. I don't know that they've actually written this in the supplemental, but they talk about characteristics of repositories. Repositories can do X, Y, and Z, and those can be more important. Those characteristics can be more important than necessarily exactly where the data is. There are some clear repositories that have a long life and a long existence within the scientific community, that clearly that's where everybody who's doing this kind of research, this is where the data goes. And this is where people are looking for their data. In lieu of that, a generalist or institutional repository that can provide for preservation of the data, and metadata that's associated with the data set, and provide a persistent identifier. These are like some of the basic things we want a repository system to do. If you can find a place that will do those things, whether it's Zenodo or Harvard Dataverse or your local library services, these will all be okay as well.
Thanks. Yeah, as somebody who runs a domain-specific archive, the longevity problem is a really tough one, right? Because we run on grant cycles. We get 5 years of funding, but we can't promise anything beyond that. So it's a real challenge. All right, good. So for the next question, for those folks who are in research data management services, are there any go-to resources that you point researchers towards to help them in budgeting?
I was going to say, Julie provides some good services. In the slide she was mentioning, those are really good resources.
Mhm.
I was going to say the start, but Julie, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of been a hot topic. We're kind of waiting for NIH to give us more resources. So I think a lot of us are just, pulling from what's out there. So that's why I went to the EU, and they have a lot of great resources there. But how well does that translate to what we're doing, here across the pond, right? So yeah, we're kind of piecing together what we have, and hopefully NIH will give us a little bit more guidance for their policy specifically.
Yeah, cool, thanks. All right, so the next question is for the FASEB folks. So I think Katie's going to take this one. Has FASEB involved equipment manufacturers to develop coordinated data dictionaries for machine level, raw, and processed data?
Yes, so the answer is not yet, but it's a great idea. So one of the things that we have been thinking about is, actually, we've started some dialogue with some organizations that are liaisons between researchers and equipment manufacturers on things in the realm of how can we make the equipment work more easily so that you get better curated data on the outset without additional sort of time and cost and effort upon the researcher. And we've heard a lot of things around sort of open proprietary formats, but the idea of sort of data dictionaries for machine level, raw and processed data, I think that's a great idea to add to our conversation list. So if the person who wrote that in wanted to send us any more details or get in touch about what they think that would be useful, that would be perfect to feed into these conversations. And again, anything else that we can do to help advocate in the field to make the things that you already use in your own processes help a better output at the end, we'd love to help with that.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of this kind of work is also going on at the sort of, the level of individual fields, right? In neuroimaging, we've had a big sort of community effort to develop data standards and metadata standards for brain imaging data. The Brain Initiative in general has been, funding a number of initiatives around standards. I assume that sort of stuff is happening in other areas as well. But I think it's really, our experience has suggested that it's really important to have those be driven by the community, because otherwise it's easy for them to kind of solve, a few people's problems, but not kind of address the field's larger set of issues. So cool. Okay. How will study sections review the budget if the data management plan is not available to reviewers? I thought it would be available to reviewers. It just wouldn't be scored. Am I correct in that understanding? John?
That's my understanding. It will be. I mean, I think it will be a question of how each study section runs things, and I think they don't all run things exactly the same way. But I think that it can certainly be made available for review and comment by the study section participants.
Katie, did you have a comment?
Well, just that we actually have a staff member from NIH on the call, Ishwar, who just raised his hands. He'd like to contribute.
I'm happy to validate that and say that that is correct. The study section members have access to the data management plan. It was to be submitted at that time, but it's not reviewed by them. So just they will look at the appropriateness of the budget at the most and provide their input. But the actual approval of the data management plan happens just in time by the program officers prior to award.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if over time reviewers start looking at that and it flavors their interpretation of the grant, right? There's a lot of reasons that a particular reviewer gets very enthusiastic about a grant or loses their enthusiasm. And even if they're told the DMP doesn't factor into your review, you can imagine that it might over time start to have an impact.
Sure, it won't be scored, that's all. I mean, they can still probably weigh in things and say things, and they might tend to look over it as well. So you can.
Yep. All right. So next question, from a library administration perspective, how many curation projects can one librarian take on? A few 5% projects add up. Yeah, they actually multiply, right? They don't add.
Yeah, a couple of things on this. One is the particular project I was talking about. We're talking about a very large project. This is tens of millions of dollars. So putting in some of my time towards such a project over a course of many years is, yeah, this is kind of something we talk about with respect to our administration. Generally, it's not part of the standard service. I'm not providing 5% of my time for every time I help researcher with data sets. This is a very large project. And the other part was it will happen years in the future. So it's who would actually be working on this as an open question. I put it to my local IT folks as well, and my administration is like, what should I write? What should I say about this? But this is very true. And this general issue, actually, I want to point out and take it as an advantage to say, our opportunity to say, is this kind of data curation work and making data sets of quality as opposed to just throwing up on a website and a repository. This takes a lot of time and effort, and it's something that if NIH wants to have quality data sets shared through the funding of the research, it's going to be something that budgeting is taken seriously to do for these actions that we've all talked about.
Yeah. So I want to kind of riff on the next question. The next question is, I think what Jonathan, you had mentioned the $8,000 AWS S3 estimated fee. I wanted to ask more generally, when you're sharing data in the cloud, there are storage costs, but there are also potentially transfer charges. And how do you, when the data are either uploaded or downloaded, how do you think about, particularly the download costs, how do you think about budgeting for those when you don't know how often the data are going to be downloaded and what those kind of become open-ended charges in some sense? Have either of you thought about that issue?
No, I'm not really given that too much thought. It is, once you get into very large data sets, maintaining a service that allows for the download of and access to files becomes a serious concern. So there are services that do provide for this. We did used to, and I don't, we'll see what Julie also has to say, but we used to, Virginia Tech, we had a Globus service. So Globus is a service that provides for transfer of very large files, multiple terabyte files through the internet in a fault tolerant way. It's really quite cool protocol they have in service. that costs a lot of money to maintain those kind of services and provide access to them. So it's not something we talked about a whole lot. And especially, it's one of those things that's especially worrisome when you have really large data sets. Honestly, what I do a lot of, and I think a lot of other repositories would maybe do, is ask people to really give consideration to, do you really need to share multiple terabytes through a website? Who benefits from this? Who benefits from you having a 2 terabyte file available? Because who can download that, and who has access to the bandwidth to do so? That's generally where I start with this, and that kind of heads off some of these concerns. But as time goes on and there's more data sharing, people will maybe expect more of these larger files to be made available, and that will be something we will need to address.
And Julie, before we move to Julie, specifically about that $8,000, can you say what exactly that was for?
The $8,000 was for making the data, preserving that data for 10 years, 3 terabytes of data for 10 years. And then being able to provide access to it or to some subset of it. But that was for preservation of that data.
Great, thanks. Julie?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate some of what John was saying. You know, those are important considerations, and Harvard DataWorks has specifically been looking at kind of the large data sharing, and has implemented what you were saying, John, with the Globus transfer. So it just released, you know, their new software installation that supports that kind of Globus transfer. So I do think we are moving into this realm of, you know, sharing larger data sets. But I do think you raised some good ethical questions about like, how much data do we need to be sharing in theory?
Thanks. So next question, and I think this is an important one. So what kind of flexibility is there in cost for the time to make sure that the data adheres to the data standards? Like you don't know up front how much time or effort it's going to take to get your data to adhere to some particular standard. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, I think this is where you want to take kind of that planning stage very seriously, and investigate those, you know, standards ahead of time. And, you know, are there community standards established? Does your repository that you plan on depositing to have metadata templates available for you to, you know, work with? So investigating that ahead of time, so you're not, you know, taken aback when you're in the moment of collecting your data and saying, like, how do I work with this? You know, what data do I actually need to be collecting, or metadata do I need to be collecting? So taking that planning stage, you know, very, very seriously. And if there aren't standards developed, you know, this may not be, you know, the time and effort you want to put in, but thinking about, you know, what data would help you, right, and use other people's data sets in the same domain, and what information would you want to see in data sets when you reuse them. Yeah, just I say start earlier rather than later.
I think that's a great point. So this next question, I think, is a really important one. You know, we've been focused on the kind of things that the kind of resources we have access to at, you know, R1 institutions, relatively wealthy institutions, but, you know, a lot of less resource institutions don't have a dedicated data librarian, right? And the kind of resources that we've been talking about. Do you have thoughts about what folks at those kinds of institutions, how they can address these challenges? Go ahead, John.
Just partial ideas to start. I mean, I'm lucky to work at a place where there are good resources, because I'm working at that place. But ways to get some access to curation support do come through some repository services to some extent. So Julie did mention, like, Dryad is a good generalist repository that does provide some level of help, you know, for a small deposit fee, some level of help towards curation and making the data available for deposit. That would be one thing. I would certainly something to think about is your research colleagues, and asking them what they can do and what they have done in the past is certainly a no cost, maybe perhaps time intensive, but no cost way to get some idea about how to access those things. Those are the first two things off the top of my head. Julie, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's also talking like in forums like this, going into your societies, see, what resources are available through there. In budgeting, you have to think about, what can you do like yourself? What are you going to take on? Maybe train yourself to do some of this work. If you're not able to, if you don't have resources or you're not able to hire someone. So I think that's also kind of a balance that we all need to think about is, are there things you can do, become an expert in to kind of supplement that work?
So how well can the Dryad team scale when hundreds of people start getting in touch asking for data curation consulting?
Yeah.
And Russ, if I may add this one as well, as you were saying, Julie, thinking about the role that societies can play, is we in DataWorks are specifically looking at, for the researchers in the fields that we're related to, biology and biomedicine, can we provide services exactly for this kind of gap for researchers who don't necessarily have as much services at their local institutions? And that's an area that we're really excited and keen to explore with others, and is something that we're thinking about in the development of our help desk specifically. So we're really glad to hear from people as to what kind of support that you would like that may not necessarily substitute for what you can get at your institution, but maybe complement it.
That's great. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question that I'm interested in, since there's nothing else queued up, which is, as a person who does human subjects research, we have to worry a lot about de-identification of our data before we share them. And, there's really challenging questions about how do you determine whether something's been properly de-identified. I'm curious to whether, y'all have in your institutions someone who can actually help researchers address that question and how that works.
You want me to go first, Julie?
Sure.
I think this is going to be interesting because Julie is coming from a medical school perspective, right? And they've thought, so we're at Virginia Tech, we don't have a medical school. So our worries, people are worried about this NIH policy. Don't worry, there's plenty of people are, but we don't have a medical school where people generally, where there's medical school, people are freaking out. So there's a lot of questions. But so to this question, Russ, we do not have somebody on campus who's going to be able to provide de-identification level support at the university. We have some people we might point at as external consulting opportunities, but we're not going to be providing these kind of services. What I've actually been generally telling people around de-identification is, if you've never de-identified data and you're thinking about doing it for the purposes of meeting this policy, you should think really hard about doing that. My recommendation would be, let's start small, incremental steps. If you've never shared data before and it's coming from human subjects, the first thing you can do is share aggregate data, share aggregate summary results that are very low risk for having that available. You've done more than you did before. Congratulations. Everybody should be happy for you. I'm happy for you. And make sure your research participants are aware that their summary data is going to be shared that way. But just start there. Don't make your life complicated by trying to de-identify data. I don't want Virginia Tech to be the institution that finds out what happens if it's done poorly and there's re-identification. But we're not, because we don't have a medical school, we're not, at this point, that's not something we're going to be providing level support. But I don't know what Julie is going to be doing at
Yeah, I think that's a awesome suggestion for where to start. I mean, yes, even at Harvard Medical School, we will not be offering, that I know of, there will not be services for de-identifying data, because there is so much that goes into it, and it is expensive, both time and monies. So we do have, like John mentioned, some experts in our data compliance office who can definitely consult and review any plans, and kind of work with our IRB and talk about what good consent language looks like, and what you could put in a sharing plan for sharing, like John said, aggregate data or statistic data, maybe sharing just the analysis code that got to those results. So there are like but I was just cued in from our ORA that a recent proposal, they had a budget like $50,000 just for the de-identification alone. So it's not a easy task. So yeah, we have resources and kind of experts as to consult with, but yeah, those services aren't being offered on our campus.
For what it's worth, I don't think we have them here at Stanford either. So.
Well, I was going to add, one of the reasons Julius mentioned $50,000, that the skill and expertise required to do this effectively is considerable. And then you also think about who's liable if things go badly. And that's where also money comes in.
Somebody asked in the chat, does anyone have these services? I've never heard of a research, data management team sharing that kind of service.
So ICPSR, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, does provide these kind of services, but they are very expensive.
Cool. And it sounds like University of Arizona does.
They do.
I think QDR does as well.
You're right. Yes, QDR as well. Qualitative Data Repository.
Cool.
I want to hear more about this, Fernando.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that seems like a good point to end our discussion. So thanks very much to our speakers.
All right, folks, I know we're about to hit the hour, but my name's Emily. I'm the community manager for this program, and I just wanted to give you a sense of some other opportunities related to the DataWorks program and how you can participate. So from this conversation, we've learned a lot about data budgeting. One of the other programs we have running is the DataWorks Prize in partnership with the Office of Data Science Strategy at the NIH. And right now we're in the process of voting for our favorites amongst a pool of 20 finalists. So you can view teams who are doing really exemplary things in data sharing and data reuse and vote for your favorite today. That voting will close on the 21st, so we've just got about a week left. Related to the program and looking at next year, if you want to go to the next slide, we've got a bunch of exciting things coming up. On the 12th of January, we'll be hosting a salon to talk about the DataWorks Prize winners and announce them publicly and be able to celebrate some of the things that are at the cutting edge of the field. If you want to advance, we've also got our website, faseb.org/DataWorks, where you can get some resources related to data management and sharing, and also our Twitter, where we're here to have conversations about what's moving forward in data management and sharing in bio and biomed. Lastly, we've got our email here to get in contact with us if you want to learn more, if you want to engage with the program as a speaker or as a presenter. And then on the 10th of January, we're launching a help desk, which will at least be a starting point and a hub for you to learn more about data management and sharing, the upcoming policy, and how you can tap into resources like the ones that were shared today and understand more about how to go forward with data sharing yourself. Grace, I believe you want to share the results or at least elevate that we have an exit poll on the Slido for folks. We would love to hear your feedback about what was helpful here and see you in future DataWorks salons.
Yes, I do. So I wanted to show our first poll and show that a lot of people were interested.
Is it just me or is Grace's audio quiet?
Yeah,
It should be better now.
quiet.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So our first bit of our poll showed that a lot of people were feeling underprepared and looking to learn. And right now we have a second poll that is live that's asking you how prepared you feel now after the session. So we really appreciate your feedback on how these sessions might help you. And then I'd also like to emphasize that we're also available to take your comments from those emails, and we love to hear from you and engage with you on what else the research community needs in this space as this data plan is launched. So I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, the question in the chat, we will be emailing both the slides that were presented today and the recording of this presentation so that you can come back to it and use it as you're preparing your budgets and looking at your data management plans. So thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of the year and are able to start the new one off in a good way as well.